Allison sat quietly in the noisy Heathrow Airport lounge, drumming her fingers nervously on her leather bag. The distant hum of conversations mingled with the occasional crackle of announcements, and the aroma of fresh coffee from a nearby kiosk reminded her of a homemade morning. She adjusted her scarf, trying to calm herself, but her heart continued to beat restlessly in anticipation and anxiety. In her 65 years, she felt out of place among travelers half her age. This trip was supposed to be her escape, a desperate attempt to break free from the loneliness that had consumed her since her husband's death 2 years ago. But loneliness pursued her here as well, unwilling to loosen its grip. As she fidgeted awkwardly in her chair, a young man entered the living room, his confidence catching her attention. Allison noticed how easily he interacted with the staff and other travelers. His charm was evident in every gesture. When their gazes met, Ethan's expression softened, and he approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am, do you need help with your bag?" he asked, his deep voice warm and inviting. Allison hesitated for a moment before nodding. She'd been struggling with the huge suitcase since she'd left the hotel, but pride wouldn't let her ask for help. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan slung the bag easily over his shoulder. "It's no problem," he replied with a smirk. "It's part of my job as a tour guide. Are you here for the tour?" Allison nodded again, surprised by his intuition. "Yes, this is my first time here. I've always wanted to travel, but life got in the way." Ethan studied her for a while, his expression unreadable. His hand rested lightly on the strap of her bag, his fingers tapping rhythmically as if considering his next words. Something flashed in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps. Then he straightened, the corners of his mouth hinting at a thoughtful smile. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." Allison felt herself drawn to his enthusiasm and ambition. He seemed so full of life, so sure of his place in the world, a stark contrast to the emptiness she felt. "And you are?" asked Ethan, interrupting her reverie. "What brings you here?" Allison hesitated. How could she put into words the pain of losing her husband, the endless days spent alone in a house that no longer felt like home? Instead, she smiled weakly. "I guess I felt like an adventure." Ethan nodded, as if he understood more than she said. "This place is full of adventure. You'll see." When they announced the group's boarding, Ethan helped her with her bag again. As they parted, he turned to her with a playful smile. "Maybe we'll meet again. The world has a funny way of bringing people together." Allison stared after him, feeling a strange flutter in her chest. She shook her head, chiding herself for being stupid. He was young, energetic, and full of potential. And yet for the first time in years she felt something inside her, a faint glimmer of excitement, a flicker of hope. The open savanna stretched endlessly, and the safari jeep bounced on the rough road. Allison sat in the back seat with her camera in hand, admiring the vast landscape. Ethan, who was sitting in the driver's seat, looked at her through the rearview mirror and smiled. "Keep your camera ready," he said, his voice louder than the hum of the engine. "This area is known for its elephants." Allison adjusted her hat and pointed the lens at the horizon. "This is incredible," she murmured. "I've never seen anything like it." Ethan grinned. "That's the magic of this place. It has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." The jeep stopped and Ethan jumped out of it, reaching out to help Allison. The touch was brief, but she caught the warmth of his skin and the lightness of his strength. Together they walked toward a shady spot where a group of elephants grazed in the distance. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation became more and more personal. Allison began to share fragments of her life that she rarely discussed. She told Ethan about her years as a teacher, the joy she found in nurturing young minds, and the emptiness that came after her retirement. Ethan listened intently, nodding in understanding. "You know," he said, leaning against the jeep, "when I was younger, I always thought life would get easier as I got older. but after hearing your story, I realized that problems just change. Allison smiled weakly. It's not the years that weigh you down, it's what you lose along the way. The honesty of her words kept them apart. Ethan turned away, staring at the horizon. I lost my father when I was 15, he admitted. That's why I started working so early to take care of my family. Allison hadn't expected such vulnerability, but it increased her respect for him. You're doing a good job, Ethan. It's not easy to face life's challenges and still hold yourself with such grace. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the world around them seemed to shrink. There were no age or cultural differences, just two people bound by shared pain and resilience. The enchantment shattered when Ethan's phone rang. He answered it quickly and spoke in a language she didn't understand. Allison turned away, focusing on the elephants, but couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Later, when the group gathered around the campfire, Allison noticed how easily Ethan made friends with the others. He laughed and joked, his charm effortlessly drawing people in. But when his eyes found hers by the fire, there was a softness in his gaze that seemed to be reserved for her. As the night grew colder, Ethan offered her his jacket. "You'll need it," he said simply. She hesitated before accepting it. Her fingers touched his fingers, and the small gesture sent a ripple through her, reminding her of a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Lying in the tent that night, Allison stared up at the ceiling, her heart heavy with confusion. She wasn't looking for anything but adventure here, and yet Ethan's presence stirred something in her, a longing she couldn't put a name to. The camp was quiet under the canopy of stars, the distant sounds of wildlife creating a nighttime symphony. Ethan approached Allison with a cautious smile, holding a tray with 2 glasses of wine. She looked up from her book, surprised but not displeased. "I thought you might like this," he said, placing the tray on the small table between them. Allison hesitated for a moment before accepting the glass he offered. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the chirping of the crickets. "You're quiet tonight," Ethan remarked, leaning back in his chair. His gaze lingered on her face, studying the lines of experience and grace that age had etched in it. "I've had a lot on my mind," Allison admitted, shaking the wine in her glass. "This trip, it's not what I expected." "Not as good or as bad?" he asked. His tone was light, but there was a depth in his eyes that unnerved her. "Good," she answered quickly, then paused. "But complicated." Ethan didn't insist, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. The light of the fire cast flickering shadows on their faces, softening the sharp edges of reality. "Can I ask you something?" said Allison finally, breaking the silence. Ethan answered without hesitation. "Sure." "Do you ever get the feeling that you're living someone else's life, like the person you were supposed to be got lost somewhere along the way?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, his expression becoming thoughtful. "It used to be. After my father died, I felt trapped in responsibility, like my dreams didn't matter anymore. But then I realized something. The life you want doesn't just find you, it has to be fought for." Allison nodded slowly, his words resonating with her. "I envy your clarity. I've been what others wanted me to be for so long, a wife, a mother, a teacher. I don't know who I am outside of those roles." "You are more than the roles you play," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You're here, exploring a new world. It takes courage." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Allison felt herself being seen in a way she hadn't seen in years. The walls she built around herself began to crack, letting in the warmth of his presence. Without hesitation, she reached out and placed her hand in his palm. The touch was brief, but it pierced them both. Ethan didn't pull away. His gaze was steady and unreadable. "I shouldn't have done that," Allison said, quickly pulling her hand away, her cheeks flushed. "Why?" asked Ethan softly. "Because it's inappropriate," she whispered, looking down into her glass. "Inappropriate doesn't mean wrong," Ethan said, leaning closer. Sometimes the things we're told not to want turn out to be the things we need most. Allison's breath caught as his words hung in the air. Slowly Ethan reached out, and his fingers touched her fingers again. This time, she didn't pull away. The world seemed to shrink, leaving the two of them alone in the glow of the fire. When Ethan leaned in, Allison's heart sped up, but she didn't stop him. Their lips met in an uncertain kiss, soft and hesitant at first, but growing deeper with each passing second. It was a moment of surrender, an acknowledgement of what had been between them since the day they met. When they finally pulled away, Allison's eyes filled with tears she couldn't explain. Ethan reached out and gently brushed one away, his touch gentle. "You're allowed to feel," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Allison didn't answer anything. A whirlwind of emotions swirled in her head. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she felt alive. The ride back to town was filled with a silence that spoke louder than words. Allison stared out the window, watching the savannah being replaced by small villages, and eventually the outskirts of the city. Ethan glanced at her occasionally, but neither of them broached the subject of what had happened the night before. At the hotel, Ethan helped her with her luggage one last time. Their gazes met for a moment, and Allison opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. Ethan gave her an understanding smile and stepped back, giving her a chance to think. Later that evening, Allison sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her phone. A message from her daughter Emily popped up on the screen. "Call me when you can, Mom." Allison sighed and pressed the call button, anticipating the inevitable conversation. "Hi, Mom." Emily's voice sounded concerned. "How was the trip?" "It was very educational," Allison replied cautiously. Emily hesitated before speaking again. "I was worried about you. I know this trip was supposed to help you heal, but is everything okay?" Allison gripped the phone receiver tighter. She wanted to tell Emily everything: the loneliness, the unexpected connection with Ethan, the kiss that had shaken her to the core. But how could she explain what she barely understood herself? "There's nothing wrong with me," she said instead, her voice flat but detached. "You don't have to worry about me." After the call, Allison felt uneasy. She stepped out onto the hotel balcony where the lights of the city stretched out before her. The cool night air did little to calm her churning thoughts. On this trip, she had made choices that went against every expectation she had set for herself. She wasn't sure she regretted them, but she knew they had changed her. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the hotel to escort her to the airport. The ride was quiet, but there was no tension between them, just an unspoken understanding. When they arrived, Ethan got out to help her with her luggage one last time. When they were standing on the curb, Allison finally found the power of speech. "Thank you for everything," she said. Ethan looked at her, his expression warm but bittersweet. "You don't need to thank me. You've taught me as much as I've taught you." Allison smiled, but she could read the sadness in her eyes. "I don't know what's going to happen next." "I don't know either," Ethan admitted. "But that's life, isn't it? We just have to move forward." Before he could doubt his own strength, Allison reached out and hugged him. It was a brief hug, but it carried all the things they couldn't say. When they pulled away, Ethan waved as she walked toward the terminal. On the plane, Allison sat by the window and went over the moments of the trip in her mind, the laughter, the conversations, the kiss. They were memories she would carry with her forever. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt a quiet determination to return home and live a fuller life. Allison began writing letters to Emily, speaking honestly about her life, her grief, and her journey to finding herself. She didn't mention Ethan by name, but his presence was woven into every word. A few months later, she came across an article about a young entrepreneur who had started a successful travel company. In the accompanying photo, Ethan stood proudly in front of a Jeep with his team. Allison smiled, her heart bursting with pride and longing. As she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, a bittersweet peace settled into her life. It was unpredictable, chaotic, and full of surprises, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally living life to the fullest.